Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be taking some notes on the presidential roles. So, when we think about the executive branch, what we need to think about is what sort of tasks is the president responsible for? We've talked about the Article 2 enumerated roles of the president. So the roles that have been set specifically in the Constitution, the expressed powers that are delegated specifically to the president. But the roles are a little bit different. These are kind of the various tasks that the president takes on, and we can kind of categorize them in a few different ways. One way I like to think about them as the president puts on kind of a different hat to perform different tasks. So one day, if he's working in ambassadorship, right, he's working with ambassadors from other nations. If he's going to state dinners, right, visiting other countries, he puts on the hat of being an ambassador, right, being a someone who works in the international relations area. Another day, he might have to, put on an entirely different hat and go to, some sort of domestic function, right? He might be meeting with union workers. He might be going to, small towns and talking to people about more local issues. So that would be more of a domestic policy hat that he has to wear that day. So using that hat metaphor, we're going to kind of explore the different roles of the executive branch. So the president's many hats, like we just talked about, some different ones come from other areas of government, right? Like he might put on a legislator hat for the day and work with congressmen in legislating different laws, might work with their own specific political party. So the president might that day have to have meetings. If they're a Republican, they might have to meet with Republican leaders and discuss party issues or issues that are important to the party. They also will have to act as head of the military, as we talked about, putting on that kind of commander-in-chief hat and maybe working with their generals, meeting with soldiers, meeting, in terms of various military conflicts that might be going on at the time. Also representing the U.S. abroad. So that's that international relations hat that we talked about. So using this hat metaphor, let's start to kind of explore. Hat number one is we call head of state / chief diplomat. They're kind of two terms that pretty much mean the same thing. We can kind of use them interchangeably. So the head of state, right, when we think about the word state, we want to make sure we're thinking of the state as in government, not the state as in the state of Pennsylvania. So head of state means the head of the government, right? Serving in an official role in representing the United States, their government, their various functions abroad. And then we've discussed the word diplomat, right? That's somebody who meets with other foreign leaders and represents their country's interests with other people who are doing the same. So that might include hosting heads of state from other nations, right? Visiting other nations on diplomatic missions. So the president can be sent to other countries, maybe where there is a conflict going on, or they can be sent to, allies in order to discuss, treaties, in order to discuss agreements, in order to, create executive agreements, that sort of thing. They also serve as head of state, doing some sort of, ceremonial activity. So ceremonial activities can be like throwing the first pitch at a baseball game, right? Serving, White House Christmas tree, setting all of that up, pardoning a turkey. These are all really traditional activities that the president is tasked to do every year. And even though they seem really menial, they help to kind of establish a good relationship with the people and solidify that image of the president being, the head of the state, right? The chief commander of the United States. An example of this would be back in 1961 during we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. We looked at some stuff about the Cold War. We'll continue to kind of explore that time period a little bit further in terms of the idea of communism and domino theory, which I'm sure you've heard about briefly, maybe in your American history class or in your world history class, but we'll do a little bit of a deeper exploration. But just to set the stage, so in 1961, there was suspicion that the Cuban government was working with the Russians, had fallen to communism. So the United States had experienced a number of propaganda attempts within they called it the Red Scare, where there was fear that the the nature of communism was going to spread around the world and take over these Western states. So John F. Kennedy was tasked with serving as head of state during this time period, which was incredibly difficult because it took a lot of navigation. But in 1961, he withdrew diplomatic missions and withdrew diplomatic support from the state of Cuba. So the US would no longer have diplomatic relations with Cuba. And that's fairly significant because the diplomatic relations means that they accept their ambassadors. So withdrawing US support meant that the Cuban ambassadors were no longer welcomed in the United States. And from then on, no diplomatic relations existed all the way until 2015. So there were a series of regime changes in Cuba between the 60s and the 2010s. But in 2015, President Barack Obama actually did reestablish relations with Cuba, just it being such a very close neighbor to the United States, right? It's only a couple hundred miles off the coast of Florida. So Raul Castro, who was the dictator in Cuba at the time, met with President Obama and they reestablished diplomatic relations. Additionally, as head of state, the job of the president is to negotiate treaties and executive agreements that falls under their foreign powers. So when the president attends, certain meetings or summits of foreign nations, or when those nations send their ambassadors to the United States or vice versa, the president's job as head of state will sometimes involve signing official documents. Those official documents are called treaties. So a treaty is much more official than an executive agreement, and that's a good way to kind of differentiate the two. Treaties are approved by the Senate. So there's not a treaty where the president just, shakes the other guy's hands like, all right, we're in agreement. The Senate must approve and has confirmation power over treaties. If we think back to our delegated powers of the Senate. So the treaties are official. They have to have a 2/3 approval from our Senate. And so if we think about our Senate right now, which is a very 50-50 split, has been for about the past decade, that's a really difficult thing to achieve. The executive agreements are a little bit more informal. There is, occasionally some sort of written document. There are, agreements between countries to do certain things, but it is not subject to confirmation by the Senate, and therefore that means it's not a treaty in any sort of formality. It's informal, no approval required. So those two jobs both fall under the president's hat as head of state and chief diplomat. Hat number 2 is commander-in-chief, and I think this is the one we're probably most familiar with. As head of the armed forces, the president has the power to, allocate troops to certain places, has the power to involve the United States in certain affairs, and they have the power to make wartime decisions. As we all know, the power to declare war lies expressly with the Congress. The Congress is the only entity that has the power to declare war. But before the 1970s, the president was much more involved, which we'll discuss. So the power can involve making wartime decisions as well. And that's really where this hat kind of lies, especially in modern days. One good example is back in World War II, we look at Franklin Roosevelt. So during the Great Depression and the involvement of World War II, the nation was in quite a bit of turmoil and the president had to take action. So Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, decided to issue the national emergency powers. He received those rather from Congress, and he was able to have power that he wouldn't normally as commander-in-chief during wartime. So he had power over setting prices, so inflation wouldn't worsen the conditions in the United States due to the Depression. And he also had power to instill rationing. So rationing is the process by which only certain goods may be purchased in certain quantities by American households. So rationing as well as price setting helped to kind of combat the Depression and combat the World War that the United States was involved in. So chief executive is hat number 3, and this is very kind of intrinsic to the branch. So this is a much more express purpose of the executive branch is to serve as chief executive. That makes sense. And that's carrying out or executing the laws of Congress. We saw that when we looked at Article 2. The power is to execute the laws. And we think of the word execute as in to, put to death. That's not what we mean here. The word execute in this case means to carry out the laws of Congress, right? Congress sets the laws, the president's job is to carry them out. So executive orders fall under that job of chief executive. Executive orders have become really popular in recent years. They are rules essentially that have the force of law that are put into place by the president, but they are not passed by Congress. So the president can issue an executive order about really a number of things. They can, set certain prices, such as, in wartime, they can do those sort of things to regulate the economy. Those have been common. There have also been talks of executive orders to do things like canceling student debt. Whether that power, would be approved by the Supreme Court, we, as at the time of this video, have yet to see. But they essentially have the force of law. The thing about an executive order is it's like a Band-Aid. It is not necessarily going to be kind of like ripped off by the next president. It's more of a layering effect. So in order to undo an executive order, you can't actually repeal them. So the Band-Aid you can't peel off, which is disgusting. But the executive orders are put into place by one president. They may only be taken out by another executive order of the next president or same president, I guess. So they are rules that are put into place with the effect of law. The chief executive also has appointment power. We've discussed that with, a number of justices, as we've seen recently, but that can also include agency directors, deputy directors, cabinet members. We just talked about the power to appoint cabinet members as the heads of the various executive departments, but the president can also appoint federal judges with confirmation by the Senate, as well as Supreme Court justices. There is something called senatorial courtesy. That's the only real limit to this power. So the president will abide by the wishes of that state's senator. So when appointing specifically judges to, federal court, circuit courts within a state, if that senator is like, hey, I don't like that guy, or doesn't particularly agree with them, or maybe even if there are different parties, there are different ideologies, the president will usually abide by what that senator wants to happen, rather than appointing somebody that they don't like, because then that wouldn't be very productive. So senatorial courtesy, again, is very unofficial, but it is a tradition that has been followed for a number of years. Also falling under the chief executive power are reprieves and pardons, and this has been a kind of topic of contention as well in the past couple of years. Reprieves and pardons are essentially creating a certain postponement or release from legal punishment. That power lies with the president in the power to execute the law. So if they believe, even though maybe a law has been broken, that there is some outstanding circumstance, or it would be better to not punish that person for whatever reason, they can either reprieve you from your punishment, so that can be lessening a sentence. Maybe you're sentenced to the death penalty, but instead of getting the death penalty, you get a certain number of years in prison. So that's some sort of like reprieve. There can also be temporary reprieves, so they can, stop, again, with the death penalty. They can kind of essentially postpone that and save it for further judgment, or, until a court can act. A pardon is a complete wiping of your record, right? You are not going to be prosecuted. You cannot be taken to court. Due to this pardon, you're essentially released from any sort of legal punishment. The reason that this would happen can kind of be explained in the next example. During the 1970s, we've talked ad nauseum about Vietnam. Intensely unpopular. There was a lot of public discord about Vietnam, and President Jimmy Carter, when he came into office, he felt that a blank slate was better for the country. So Vietnam had essentially kind of come to a close by the end of the term of Richard Nixon. When Carter came into office, he essentially said, we're not going to allow this to further kind of stain our nation's legacy. So what Jimmy Carter did was he essentially said that all of the people who were avoiding the military, avoiding the draft we know is an implied power of Congress, just a little review, but the draft evaders, people who were resisting going to war as a form of protest, they were subject to either imprisonment, severe fines. A lot of them carried pretty hefty prison sentences. So the American public was in the process of, prosecuting these people. But Jimmy Carter felt that, Vietnam had been such a complete stain on the American history, it was better to move forward. So what he did is he actually issued what we call amnesty. So this is a group pardon. So a pardon would be for like, one or two people, but amnesty is a blanket statement. So he issued amnesty saying that any offenses against the government that were committed, again, it's usually military, but any offenses that were committed by these draft evaders for, avoiding their mandatory military service, they were pardoned from those consequences. So they received amnesty. The next hat number 4, is agenda setter and chief legislator. Again, that's kind of a dual hat. Agenda setter is kind of working more within the party. Chief legislator, a little more toward Congress, but we combine them together because they both have to do with the legislative capacity. So the president is set to work a number of times with the Congress over legislation, national issues. Obviously, they are able to veto legislation. So with chief legislator, right, they're not actually the person in charge of writing the legislation, but they do have ultimate power over vetoing that legislation. So that's where that title kind of comes in. They also are a significant agenda setter in issuing the State of the Union each year. So we watched our State of the Union address, but this is an annual address where the president addresses the issues to Congress as well as the various cabinet members that he wants legislation created on. So this is kind of a call to action for Congress. So that also falls a little bit under that chief legislator role. You see how the two are very similar. So we talked about the veto. The veto is the act where a president can refuse to sign or veto bills that are passed by Congress. And we call veto basically an all or nothing, because you can't select pieces of a bill that you like versus a bill that parts of the bill that you don't like. So the line item veto is a practice that used to be involved within the executive offices, but it is no longer constitutional. The line item veto would essentially be something where the president could look at a piece of legislation and black out parts of it. So almost redact them. If you've ever seen a redacted document, that's where large portions of the text are kind of blacked out so you can't read them. That's sort of similar to what a line item veto would be. It would be that certain lines would just kind of poof, like disappear from the bill. So line item vetoes really compromise the integrity of the bill. So the Supreme Court actually used judicial review to remove the line item veto from the president's powerhouse, citing checks and balances. They felt that this was a violation of separation of powers, that the president would have too much legislative capacity, and that would be unconstitutional. When we were talking about the powers of Congress in terms of legislation power, we talked about how the president has to sign a bill in order for it to become law. That actually isn't entirely true. We talked about a pocket veto. So a pocket veto is where a president, if they do not sign a law within 10 days and Congress actually adjourns during that 10-day period, meaning that the session is over, or there's a recess or a break in Congress. After that 10 days, if Congress adjourns during those 10 days, then the bill automatically dies because it can't be returned to Congress to override it. So the pocket veto is slightly different than the 10-day rule, in that the 10-day rule, if the president doesn't sign the bill within 10 days, it actually passes. So whether or not the president signs it, the bill will become law in 10 days unless he uses the veto. The only reason the president would kind of let a bill become law without signing it is to show that his disapproval. So if he knows that Congress would get a 2/3 majority, he can kind of do that math. If he knows that Congress would get the 2/3 majority, but the bill, it's kind of useless for him to use the veto because the bill would pass anyway. So the 10-day rule means that he can kind of let it pass without signing it. It's kind of showing his disapproval. All right, last two hats, and these are quick. So hat number 5 is the keeper of the economy. We haven't talked about a ton of economic policy so far. We've talked about a little bit how the budget committee in Congress passes the budget, but the president actually has quite a role in involving the budget and passing the budget as well. So the president is in charge of supervising the budget and kind of passing laws to combat economic problems. So the president, as we've said, is not always a PhD in economics. That would be a little bit ridiculous to expect that of someone, to not only be a master in foreign policy, but also a PhD in economics and also to understand environmental policy. That's not entirely possible. So with the cabinet, one kind of body that is regularly involved in kind of consulting the president is the Council of Economic Advisors. So their job is to study the economy and provide reports to the president as to what's going on in certain sectors as well as overall. They keep track of inflation and unemployment and all of those various issues that the president will then push Congress to legislate on, or he can use executive orders, etc. So employment, production, trade, again, the budget deficit are huge issues that the president is accountable for. They impact elections. So the president is always kind of involved in their enforcement. So we'll talk a little bit later about what the budget deficit is. That's something kind of in the common vernacular these days in the news. So we'll kind of look at what that is and what that means. But for now, kind of what you need to know is the president does have a hand in, regulating the economy, but the president is not solely responsible for the economy. Right? The economy is its own cycle. If you want to take macroeconomics with Mr. McNair next year, I highly recommend. But that'll kind of tell you that even though the government does have a hand in pushing the economy in certain directions, the economy will still maintain its very cyclical nature. So they're kind of in charge of keeping it way in check within a certain boundary. If it goes way out of whack, but they're not usually involved in kind of the everyday cycle of, inflation, deflation, supply and demand. So one thing I do want to look at that the president is very involved in with the economy is the budget process. So the budget cycle begins in the fiscal year, not the annual year. So the fiscal year is actually October to October. So the new fiscal year begins in October, and the president will actually submit budgets to Congress November, December into January. So the House and Senate will then mark up and pass the budget. So we'll go directly to the budget committee. The budget committee will take an in-depth look at it. They are more expert in what the budget looks like. They'll decide what funding goes to what programs. They decide how we fund, keeping up our infrastructure, how we pay our government employees, right? How we maintain things like trash service. That is all, kind of falls under that budget of the government, especially, in Washington, D.C., their budget falls directly under the government because they don't have any state government. But the House and Senate will then send it from their budget committee. They will pass it in the general House and general Senate. And if necessary, the House and Senate will assign it to a conference committee, if you remember conference committees. Going down to the bottom left there, the appropriations committees within each part of the Senate and the House will then pass spending bills. So spending bills, as we know, have to be from those appropriations committees. Revenue bills do have to originate in the House, and then eventually they will come to some sort of reconciliation or authorization of the bills. The bills will pass. So that's more where kind of the president has a little more power at the beginning and the end. So submitting the budget to Congress is really where the president has power. They say, this is what I want our money spent on. And then the House and Senate will take it from there. The president then also kind of has a hand in reconciliation and authorization of that bill. He has to sign it. It will then pass. Then the new fiscal year begins. So it is a highly cyclical nature. Last thing the president does is they act as party chief. This is the final hat. As party chief, the president's job is to support his own party and its members. So it is still a very party-centric, two-party nature of the beast here. So the president will attend functions for his party. So they'll, have kind of like party conventions, but even past that, attending, dinners, things like that with other prominent members of the party. But they also endorse candidates for office. So if other prominent members of the party, such as, if it's a Republican president, a Republican governor is running for re-election, they can ask for the endorsement of that president. Endorsement is not anything, it's not a government document, but it's very official in the nature that that person is putting their name on that candidate, right? You're staking your reputation on another person's actions. So endorsement is a very serious thing. You can kind of see two examples in the pictures here, right? Both of our two previous presidents before the current one, but we have endorsement in both of those, right? So either attending that person's events, right? You can see former President Trump there on the bottom left attending events for the North Carolina Republican Party, but then an official endorsement there on the right of Barack Obama for Mary Manoogian. Sorry, I was mispronounced her last name. For state representative. So he's officially putting his name on her candidacy. They also, kind of push candidates for other offices, as well as selecting the national party chair. That is also highly significant. The national party chairs will kind of continue to work with the party for, primaries, for local elections, for a number of things. So as party chief, the president does have a significant amount of power as well. So those are all 6 hats. Hopefully you were able to get all of those in your notes. What you're going to do now is head on over to Classroom and open up the Identify That Role activity and work to use your notes to figure out which role best describes or best applies to each situation. Good luck.